Well, hello and welcome to the IEA School of Thought series with me, Syed Kamall. School of Thought is our weekly show on classical liberal thought, looking at different strands of thought within classical liberalism and discussing leading classical liberal thinkers, but also applying some of these ideas to current issues. This show was inspired by the IEA book, School of Thought, 101 Great Liberal Thinkers by Eamon Butler, which offers an understanding of the pro-freedom side of debates around politics, government, social institutions, capitalism, rights, liberty, and morality. In this series, we consider a number of questions and issues, including whether classical liberals, who today support government interventions and restrictions on civil liberties, have abandoned classical liberalism. But before we start, please check out our online content on the IEA YouTube channel. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our IEA Daily Bulletin to make sure you don't miss out on any of our thought-provoking content. Now, today's featured thinker is Adam Smith. And who better to discuss him with me today than our guest, Madsen Pirie, who is the co-founder of the Adam Smith Institute. Madsen, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Hello.
So Madsen, you've chosen Adam Smith to discuss with me today. Can you explain why? Did he have a profound impact on you specifically? And what is it that you admire about him?
Well, yes, indeed. Adam Smith is generally regarded as the founder or even inventor of modern economics. The Adam Smith Institute was actually founded in 1977, but the inception was 1976, which was a very good year because it was the year in which Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations and single-handedly changed the way everyone thought about economic activity and trade. You could go as far as to say that the world's economic system today is entirely derived from those pages that Adam Smith wrote all those years ago.
So you talk about him in terms of economics. How important do you, or influential do you think he's been in shaping the classical liberal narrative, as well and political thought as a whole?
Of course, Adam Smith was famous as a philosopher before he acquired fame as an economist. His book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, made him famous. But it was a philosophical work in which he said that the most salient human trait is our ability to empathize with our fellow men and women. He used the word sympathy, but in fact, it's closer to the modern word empathy. He says we identify with our fellow men and women, and we feel joy when they do and sorrow when they do. And of course, to those nearest and dearest to us, we feel the strongest. But we never lose this, even for the most distant person on this planet. We have that kind of affinity. We identify with them. We want to be thought of well, and we construct in our minds, what he called an impartial spectator. That you could call it a conscience, the one who judges what we do and basically restrains us.
Now, you spoke of him in terms of his valuable contribution to economics. Many consider him the founder of modern economics, and most people look at the book *The Wealth of Nations*. But you also mentioned the theory of moral sentiments. Do you think these works complement each other, or are there contradictions between the two?
Well, many people make the mistake of supposing that the two do contradict each other, but in fact, that's wrong. Smith nowhere says that a person ceases to be a human being when they engage in economic activity. Some people wrongly suppose that he did, but there's not the slightest suggestion of that. When we engage in economic activity, we still have to be moral and decent in human persons, treat other people with respect, and so on. So, yes, the two are entirely complementary.
Many people obviously think about the wealth of nations. Do you think the theory of moral sentiments has been somewhat abandoned as we look back, or underrated or underestimated when we look back at his works?
The theory of moral sentiments was very, very famous in his day, of course. But the point is that the Wealth of Nations was so innovative, so important, so earth-shaking, that it has somewhat eclipsed the other book, not because it's inferior, but simply because most people are more interested in economics than we are in moral philosophy. Economics is all about the bread and butter of daily survival and how we prosper and how we improve our life. Indeed, Adam Smith himself said in that book, he spoke of the constant and uninterrupted effort of every man to better his condition. And it is true, that's what we do every day. So the book assumes a larger significance because of that, I think.
And you say the book was well known at the time. Did he struggle to get his ideas heard at the time? And was he one of those people who wrote at a certain time, but only vindicated later? Or did he have an immediate impact?
Adam Smith became, first of all, he was already famous when The Wealth of Nations was published because of his earlier book. It had an immediate impact. It hit the world, like the intellectual world, like a thunderclap. Nothing was ever the same thereafter. No, he didn't have to struggle away in a garret for years before he received recognition. He was part of a circle in Edinburgh, the Scottish Enlightenment, which covered Glasgow as well. And he was surrounded virtually every day by brilliant scholars, people who each one individually ranked in the first division as a great thinker. There they were, David Hume, whom he met several times a week in taverns in Edinburgh to talk philosophy, economics, and about the world and history. Adam Ferguson, William Robertson, and all of the others. No, he was immediately recognised.
Now, you talked about his community of the sort of Scottish Enlightenment at the time, but that was during his own time. Who did he look back to? Who was he inspired by?
Adam Smith always said that the principal influence on forming his thought was, of course, the scholar Francis Hutcheson. But many of the Scottish Enlightenment people said the same. He was reckoned, indeed, to have started the Scottish Enlightenment, and both Hume and Smith paid him due homage.
And did he, like some thinkers tend to look back even further, sometimes go back to ancient thinkers? Did he go back much further in history, or was it really around his time and just before that?
Of course, Adam Smith himself acknowledged a debt to Bernard Mandeville, whose rather subversive book, The Fable of the Bees, showed that when bees try to be honest, moral, and decent, it produces disastrous chaos. Whereas if they pursue their own self-interest, it actually works better. And the book created outrage, of course, because it was a completely, shall we say, immoral idea that people being non-virtuous could produce a better result than people being virtuous. But Mandeville was amongst his influences. And that's one reason why, when Stoddart did the sculpture of him in Edinburgh now, there are bees crawling over the book that he's holding. That's a little joke reference to Mandeville and the Fable of the Bees.
So let's talk about the statue. It took about 218 years after his death to have that statue erected. Why do you think it took so long for him to be honoured in his own country?
It's an interesting thought. The fact is that Scotland has not, on the whole, in recent years certainly, tended to follow the economics of Adam Smith. They've tended to be more statist, looking more to governments to do things. Smith himself was highly sceptical of government. I mean, the reason why he's regarded as a great liberal thinker was because he thought that individuals were far better equipped to make decisions about their lives than remote and distant governments with other objectives to pursue. He thought that governments were profligate, whereas people tended to spend their own money wisely, governments tended to spend it foolishly. Now, the modern Scotland goes along with the other school and regards the state to some extent as the solution. The real reason, I suppose, is that no one got round to it until Eamon Butler came along and decided that the man ought not to be without honour in his own country, and organised the raising of funds to which many private donors gave very generously, and enabled that statue to be erected in the prime site in Edinburgh.
So you've talked about what he thought, and clearly, and he wrote a lot about that. But what was he actually like as a person?
Adam Smith was, in fact, the typical, woolly-minded, absent-minded professor. He once he put bread and butter into his teapot by mistake. He walked 15 miles into town in his dressing gown because he'd forgotten to get dressed. And he was very much an unworldly figure in his personal habits. He spent most of his life living with his mother. I suppose the biggest adventure that ever happened to him was at the age of 4, when he was kidnapped by gypsies, and his uncle led a horseback posse in the forest to rescue him. The rest of his life was somewhat duller after that.
Did he ever get married or have a family?
No, he never got married, never raised a family, nor did David Hume, his great contemporary and friend.
And you talked a bit about his community, and you talked about his friends. Tell me a little bit about that community. It must have been a fascinating time. I'm sure when people look back, maybe many think they themselves would have liked to have been part of a community as a sort of part of the Enlightenment.
Yes, I sometimes like to think back what it must have been like to meet in the evenings in Edinburgh taverns with people like Smith and Hume and the other Enlightenment thinkers. Of course, they'd meet by candlelight or by lamps lit with whale oil, because there was no other form of lighting. They'd go home through narrow streets, cobbled streets in darkness, listening to the shouts of "Gardez-le" as people threw sewage from those high tenements down on. You see, it was a mixture of the modern world intellectually with a world that was still a little bit primitive as far as sanitation and home creature comforts are concerned. So it was quite a contrast.
Now, classical liberals often talk about enlightened self-interest, inspired by Smith and other classical liberal thinkers. But Smith is often criticised on the left as extolling selfishness rather than self-interest. Is this a valid criticism of his ideas?
No, it's a misreading to say that Smith was in any way justifying selfishness. What he said was that famously, we don't owe our dinner to the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. It is not from benevolence that they do this. They give us our dinner, but from their own self-interest. He was talking about their enlightened self-interest, the desire of every person to better their lot. He wasn't talking about being selfish, which means doing this at the expense of other people. It's done in cooperation with other people to mutual advantage. So it's very far from selfishness. But the left misunderstand that, either accidentally or deliberately.
And when you look back at Adam Smith and his works, what do you think the biggest lesson classical liberals today can learn from his ideas?
I think the biggest lesson is that individuals make the best decisions about their own lives. They know more about their own lives. They're closer to their own lives. They care more about the people closest to them. The distant bureaucrat or government minister has no such affection or motivations, and indeed far less knowledge. They're pursuing different objectives for their own advancement. And it's far better if we just let people cumulatively interact with each other and generate spontaneously that wonderful thing we call the market. Indeed, it was one of Smith's contemporaries who coined the phrase, the product of human construction, but not of human design.
That was Ferguson, wasn't it? Yes. So when we look at we're in the midst of a pandemic at the moment. We see all sorts of government intervention. Many classical liberals reluctantly support government intervention because we have a natural skepticism of government, but we realise it's an emergency. How relevant do you think some of the ideas of Smith are today during the pandemic, and how should we be thinking about it?
Well, Smith did recognise that there was a role for intervention, for government. There are some things that the market just doesn't do. One of them, for example, is to deal with an emergency. There's no way the market can anticipate a hurricane, a typhoon, or indeed an epidemic. What the market can do, however, is to make society sufficiently adaptable and creative, so that even though it can't, so to speak, predict and anticipate disasters that come externally, it can at least make society sufficiently resilient if people are in the habit of dealing in this way. If private sector can leap into gaps and fill shortfalls that occur, if food can be rushed to where it's needed by people anxious to sell it, all of these things show what can be done, so to speak, without the state. But Smith did recognise that there are cases, these external shocks, where we might need state direction.
If I asked you in summing up, what are the sort of one or two things that stand out about Adam Smith to you when people ask you about Adam Smith and they say, "Tell me about Smith," or "Tell me about thought"? What is it that stands out to you?
There are some unusual things that Smith said that seem almost counterintuitive. Many people today praise self-sufficiency. They talk about buying locally and making ourselves independent of others. But Smith realized all that does is make you poorer. In his most famous example, we could produce grapes on Ben Nevis by hot walls and glass houses, and we could produce wine at 30 times the cost that foreigners can produce it. Far better to buy their cheap stuff and leave money in our pockets to buy other things with. So it's counterintuitive, but every day you'll hear people standing up in Parliament urging Britain to export more to make us wealthier. No, it's imports, said Smith. that make us wealthier. The only reason we do exports is to pay for those lovely goodies we get from other people that make us richer.
I think I've come to the end of the questions. Is there anything else that you kind of wish I'd asked you, or you think I should add?
I think the only thing that I would add to that is the recognition that although you think that a few people at the centre acquiring knowledge can impose a plan or pattern on society, Smith basically taught us that that is far inferior to everybody making their own plans, interacting with each other to mutual advantage. The world is a better place because they do that. No planners can ever come anywhere near that objective.
I think on those words, Madsen, I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a fascinating insight into Adam Smith and his work. Can I thank all of you who are watching for tuning in today. For more information on our other work on the history of pandemics, on the economic and regulatory impact of the coronavirus, and much more, please visit our website, www.iea.org.uk. Check out our YouTube channel and subscribe to our IEA Daily Bulletin to stay updated on all our activity. Thank you very much for joining us.